was it like on the set of Little House on the Prairie? The actress who played Michael Landon's wife says it wasn't as wholesome as it seemed.
Little House on the Prairie was the biggest thing.
From 1974 to 1983, the Ingalls family became a household name, with Michael Landon, Melissa Gilbert, and the rest of the cast bringing Laura Ingalls Wilder's stories to life in a way that felt timeless.
Right now, Little House on the Prairie. It was a family favorite in the 70s and 80s. Now fans are gathering to celebrate the Emmy-winning show's 50th anniversary. Chris Connolly spoke exclusively with three of the show's stars. Good morning, Chris.
But the end of Little House wasn't just another quiet farewell. Instead, it concluded with one of the most shocking moments ever broadcast on network television, and many couldn't help but wonder why. While it might have seemed like a dramatic plot twist, it turns out there's more to the story, and at the forefront was none other than Michael Landon. Over 40 years later, we're breaking down all the behind-the-scenes details behind the infamous scene, the feuds, creative battles, and the truth behind why Little House on the Prairie really went off the air. Let's get started. The chapter that changed it all. Before diving into the infamous finale, we need to understand why Little House on the Prairie had such an impact in the first place. Premiering in 1974, the show was adapted from Laura Ingalls Wilder's beloved books about her childhood in the late 19th century. But what could have easily been a simple family drama became something much bigger under the creative control of Michael Landon. He wasn't just the star of the show, playing Charles Ingalls. He was also a writer, director, and producer, and that meant he had the final say in most creative choices. Unlike many family-oriented shows of the era, one thing that stood out about Little House was that it wasn't afraid to touch on darker themes. The show portrayed pioneer hardships with startling realism: death, illness, racism, alcoholism, even addiction. Episodes often ended on bittersweet notes rather than easy resolutions, making it stand apart from other wholesome dramas on television. So why did viewers enjoy it so much? Well, many said they tuned in not only for heartwarming family lessons, but also for moments that confronted life's toughest realities head-on. By the early 1980s, however, things began to change, and the show's ratings started to slip. After nearly a decade on the air, audience tastes were shifting, and newer programs were competing for attention. NBC decided to end the series, though the network gave Landon the space to craft a proper conclusion. But what came next would shock viewers, not because of the storyline itself, but because of what it symbolized both on screen and behind the scenes. The TV movie Little House, The Last Farewell, which aired in 1984, gave fans one final look at Walnut Grove. But instead of a sentimental goodbye, audiences watched in disbelief as the town was destroyed with dynamite. In the story, a greedy land baron claims ownership of Walnut Grove and tries to seize it from its residents. Rather than let him take their homes, the townspeople make a collective decision. If they can't keep Walnut Grove, then no one will. In a series of powerful scenes, families set charges of explosives and blow up the very buildings that had been the backdrop of nearly a decade of television history. For audiences, it was a stunning and emotional twist. The schoolhouse, the mercantile, even the homes viewers had grown attached to, all reduced to rubble in front of their eyes. It was unlike anything TV had seen before. After all, this wasn't just a fictional town. It was the physical set where actors, crew members, and fans had invested years of storytelling. And what made it even more compelling was that the demolition wasn't a visual effect or a clever camera trick. Landon had actually ordered the set to be destroyed with real dynamite. Insane, isn't it? Although the choice was bold, it wasn't random. For a while, Landon's frustration with NBC had been growing, and he had determined that Little House should go out on his terms. In his words, he didn't want to see Walnut Grove reused as a backdrop for another show or left to decay. So the smartest choice was to actually blow it all up, because by doing so, he made sure that Little House ended with a definitive full stop, both in narrative and in reality. Cast members have since recalled that the experience felt like attending a funeral. Melissa Gilbert, who played Laura Ingalls, later described it as a long goodbye. Devastating, but strangely fitting. So how did viewers respond? At the time, reactions were mixed. Some appreciated the symbolic farewell, recognizing it as a dramatic way of closing the chapter. Others felt it was unnecessarily violent, almost sacrilegious, to destroy such an iconic setting. Fans who tuned in expecting a tender, nostalgic ending were instead confronted with explosions and loss. And for many, the memory of Walnut Grove going up in flames left them unsettled. Just like that, the finale became one of the most infamous episodes in TV history. But we can't talk about the finale episode and all the drama surrounding it without first touching upon all of the build-up to it. And to do that, we've got to ask ourselves a very important question. Did Landon's shocking choice actually lead to the show being taken off the air? The truth behind the show's end. The truth is a little more complicated than what it seems. While it might appear that Little House on the Prairie was canceled because of this episode, or even Landon's creative choices, it was never pulled as a result of any of these. Well, Landon had an awful lot to do with it, but the series itself had already wrapped up due to declining ratings. And the destruction of Walnut Grove was simply the best possible way to put a close to a story that had spanned years. What's interesting, though, is how memory has transformed the finale into legend. Over the years, fans have repeated the story of Walnut Grove's destruction as if it were a punishment from the network, or as though the violence of the scene itself got the show banned. In reality, the finale was broadcast and even rerun a few times, but it didn't have the same longevity and syndication as other episodes. Networks often preferred to replay lighter, more family-friendly storylines, and considering the sheer bleakness of the finale, it meant it was rarely shown again. Over time, that absence fed into the myth that it had been taken off the air. But while the infamous demolition of Walnut Grove may have been the most dramatic on-screen ending, the true sparks of conflict came from behind the scenes. Behind the scenes, Little House's hidden quirks. Before we get right into all of the drama and conflicts behind the scenes, let's quickly go over some of the little quirks you might not have noticed while watching the show. Even Little House on the Prairie, that emblem of frontier charm and familial warmth, had its share of quirky mishaps, tiny anachronisms, costume snafus, and odd moments that escaped the editing room. One of the most amusing timeline oddities involves Laura's pregnancy during Season 7. Viewers noticed that despite the warm, flower-blooming scenes suggesting spring had arrived, Laura remained heavily pregnant well into the following summer, prompting fans to joke that Prairie time just moves at its own pace. Then, there's the ever-iconic Nellie Oleson with her perfect curls. Fans might be surprised to learn that Alison Arngrim's golden ringlets weren't natural. They were wigs, secured firmly onto her scalp with metal combs and pins. The process was so grueling, some stories even say it caused her scalp to bleed on occasion. But perhaps the most hilarious blooper involves a time-traveling chicken magnate. In the Season 8 episode, Wave of the Future, Colonel Sanders, yes, the Colonel, appears to pitch a fast food deal in Walnut Grove. The problem? Cats, both the man and his chicken empire, didn't exist until the mid-1900s, long after Little House's pioneer era. Fans have joked that the fried chicken on set may very well have been KFC. Not all errors were about comedic time slips. Some were more practical blunders. In the holiday episode, Bless All the Dear Children, set in the frosty streets of Minneapolis, that's because the show was actually filmed in scorching Tucson, Arizona. And there were costume slips, too, a glimpse of Caroline's modern-style bra, and hairstyles that looked more 1970s than 1870s. Men were mostly clean-shaven, too, clashing with the bearded norms of the era. On the action front, there's the sight of a dummy falling from a train during a stunt, a visible stand-in that can betray even the most dramatic sequences. And not all behind-the-scenes takes were serious. Landon, snagged between takes, enjoyed pulling pranks, most infamously involving frogs, causing giggles amid the strict pioneer world. There's also casting trivia that brought future stars onto the Walnut Grove stage. Sean Penn had his on-screen debut as Kid in Season 1's The Voice of Tinker Jones, and Jason Bateman appeared as James Cooper Ingalls. And for eagle-eyed fans, there's something else. Even in the final 2-hour TV movie finale, The Last Farewell, set in 1901, the residents barely looked a day older than their series characters, despite the years that had actually passed. It's a subtle visual cue that time in Walnut Grove often stood still. But the fun thing about these bloopers and quirks is that they somehow don't distract, they charm. They remind us that producing a beloved period drama, season after season, is a living, breathing endeavor. And they give us a glimpse of how even the most deliberate shows can hold a handful of delightful surprises hidden in plain sight. Now that we've covered the more wholesome aspects, let's deep dive into the behind-the-scenes drama that threatened to overwhelm the show. Production and feuds. To understand why Little House on the Prairie ended the way it did, we need to shift our focus to the people running the show, both behind and on screen, and the tensions that often simmered beneath its wholesome surface. At the heart of Little House was Landon, who was far more than just Charles Ingalls, the devoted pioneer father. Landon was the driving creative force. He wrote many of the scripts, directed countless episodes, and worked as an executive producer. In essence, it was practically his show. He'd attained a level of control that gave him the power to shape Little House into something that was often deeper and darker than people expected from a family drama. But with that power also came clashes, with networks, with producers, and even with his own castmates. One of the earliest feuds was between Landon and Ed Friendly, the show's co-creator. Ed had helped develop the series for television, but he soon found himself pushed aside. Why? Because Landon's vision for the show was different from Ed's more traditional, family-friendly approach. Landon wanted to tackle serious themes, to push the boundaries of what was acceptable for primetime audiences. Ed, on the other hand, thought the show should stick closer to Wilder's original books. Pretty soon, their creative differences escalated, and before long, Landon's dominance on the set meant his counterpart was effectively cut out of the process. Will. But the conflicts didn't stop there. Landon's relationship with Karen Grassel, who played Caroline Ingalls, was especially complicated. On screen, Charles and Caroline were the backbone of the Ingalls family, steady, supportive, and loving. Off-screen, however, Caroline often felt sidelined and undervalued. She later revealed that she struggled to get fair pay, claiming that Landon refused to give her raises that matched what other stars on NBC dramas were making. In interviews, she admitted that she felt disrespected by his treatment, describing Landon as both charismatic and difficult. But their clashes weren't always about money. Caroline also recalled moments where Landon made crude or disparaging jokes on set, which she found humiliating. Although the two later reconciled years later during the run of the show, their relationship was often strained. It's ironic, really, because for a series built around family values and respect, it was a reminder that the reality behind the camera didn't always mirror the storylines being told on screen. Still, Landon wasn't universally disliked. In fact, many cast members adored him and credited him with guiding their careers. Melissa Gilbert, who played Laura Ingalls, often spoke of Landon as a father figure. She was just 10 years old when the series. He had final say over storylines, tone, and casting decisions. That meant when feuds broke out, his voice was always the loudest. For example, Alison Arngrim, who played the infamous Nellie Oleson, once shared how Landon could be blunt and intimidating if he felt actors weren't performing up to standard. And although she acknowledged that intensity was inspiring, most times it felt exhausting. Another feud worth mentioning came near the end of the show's run, when the network itself clashed with Landon. NBC was ready to move on from Little House, but Landon felt the series still had life left in it. Ratings were falling, but he believed that with the right storylines, audiences could be drawn back. NBC disagreed. To them, the series had run its course, and the best thing to do was to take it down. As expected, the two sides locked horns. Eventually, they reached a compromise to end Little House on the Prairie after its 9th season and continue with a short-lived spin-off, Little House, A New Beginning, which shifted focus to Laura and Almanzo. Without Landon at the center, however, the spin-off faltered, lasting only 1 season. These creative tensions with NBC also played a role in Landon's decision to destroy the Walnut Grove set. From his perspective, NBC hadn't respected the show's legacy, and he wasn't going to leave behind a set that could be casually repurposed. But while he comes across as a man willing to do anything to protect whatever he cherishes, Landon wasn't exactly the best guy back home. When he began working on Little House, he was a married man. However, his matrimonial vows weren't enough to stop his wandering eyes from landing on the show's makeup artist, Cindy Clerico. Unfortunately, while he was still married to his wife at the time, he began an affair with Cindy. Unsurprisingly, the affair caused a little bit of a stir amongst the cast and crew. Not only was Landon having an affair while he was still married, but he was also 20 years younger than his new lover. As expected, the affair caused a strain in Landon's friendship with his castmates. However, as questionable as the love between the cheating duo was, it appeared to be real. They tied the knot in 1983 and remained married until Landon's passing in 1991. While Landon's relationship with Cindy eventually led to a lasting marriage, it wasn't without fallout. The affair left deep scars, particularly among his closest friends and co-stars, including Melissa Gilbert. Melissa had always viewed Landon as more than just a boss. After her adoptive father passed away, she grew close to the Landon family, especially since she was best friends with Landon's daughter Leslie. To Melissa, he became a genuine father figure, which made his betrayal feel all the more personal. Hurt and disillusioned, Melissa held on to her anger for nearly a decade. For 9 years after Little House ended, she refused to reconcile with him. But time eventually softened the silence. She made a surprise appearance with Landon on The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, and in private, they finally made peace. Tragically, just a week later, Landon passed away from aggressive pancreatic cancer. Their reconciliation was brief, but at least it allowed them to close the chapter on better terms. But before we go about throwing stones at Landon, it's important to remember, too, that feuds weren't always hostile. Sometimes they depicted the passion of a cast and crew who cared deeply about the work. And truth be told, Little House demanded long filming hours, emotional performances, and often uncomfortable conditions on set. Cast members endured sweltering heat, heavy costumes, and challenging outdoor shoots. Frustrations naturally flared, but they also bonded over the shared struggle. Melissa Sue Anderson, who played Mary Ingalls, once described the experience as both grueling and rewarding. A show that tested its cast, but also gave them unforgettable memories. For Melissa Anderson, one such memory is possibly the fact that she and co-star Melissa Gilbert never really got along. It's hard to believe, isn't it? But the BTS reality was very different from the on-screen portrayal. While the duo might have looked like the perfect pair and possibly even made real-life sisters envious of their relationship, the truth was that both of these young women never actually liked the other. Why? Well, the simple answer is that Melissa Gilbert couldn't bring herself to warm up to her co-star even years later. In her memoir, Prairie, she didn't hold back, calling Melissa Anderson cold and stuck up. And Gilbert wasn't alone in that impression. Alison Arngrim, who played Nellie Oleson, remembered how early on Gilbert had pulled her aside with a warning, "Whatever you do, you watch out for that Melissa Sue Anderson. She's very dangerous. She's evil, and I hate her." At first, Alison tried to bridge the gap herself, but she quickly found Anderson difficult to reach, describing her demeanor as oddly artificial, like a well-trained beauty pageant contestant, and admitting that, after a while, simply being nice to her became a sort of Zen exercise in patience. Gilbert, meanwhile, confessed in her memoir that although the two were cast as sisters, there was never a real sisterly bond between them. There was a distance to her, a coldness, Gilbert wrote. She wasn't easy to get along with. Looking back, Gilbert also reflected that Anderson seemed to live entirely within her mother's universe, more controlled and guarded than open and expressive. That same tension between appearance and reality extended beyond the cast's personal dynamics into the show's storytelling itself, because for all its reputation as wholesome family entertainment, Little House on the Prairie frequently waded into controversial waters. Beneath the pastoral imagery and heartwarming lessons, the series often stepped directly into sensitive territory, sometimes pushing boundaries in ways that were considered groundbreaking at the time, but which today feel questionable, even unsettling. Controversial content and evolving standards. For a show so often remembered as wholesome family entertainment, Little House on the Prairie didn't shy away from controversy. From episodes that tackled intimate assault and racism to romantic storylines that involved underage characters, Little House walked a fine line between daring television and problematic content. Looking back now, these moments depict just how much cultural standards have shifted since the 1970s and 80s. One of the most striking examples came in the two-part storyline Sylvia from Season 7. In this harrowing arc, the character Sylvia, a shy teenage girl, becomes the target of a masked intimate assaulter who assaults her, leaving her pregnant. For a family drama airing in primetime, this was nearly unthinkable subject matter. Audiences tuned in, expecting tales of resilience and morality on the frontier, not a brutal narrative about intimate violence and the stigma attached to pregnancy outside of marriage. The show portrayed Sylvia's trauma with unusual frankness for the era. She struggles with shame, secrecy, and the cruel judgment of others. For some viewers, the storyline was powerful and even ahead of its time, confronting a taboo subject with seriousness rather than dismissing it. But for others, it felt disturbingly out of place in a series often marketed as family viewing. Letters poured in, criticizing Landon and the producers for subjecting children to such dark themes. Today, many fans still debate whether Sylvia was a brave attempt to spark conversation or a deeply inappropriate storyline that forever darkened the show's tone. But Little House didn't only stir controversy with its depictions of trauma. Romantic storylines between adult and underage characters have aged especially poorly under modern scrutiny. The most famous example is the relationship between Laura Ingalls and Almanzo Wilder, played by Dean Butler. In real life, Laura and Almanzo did marry, and the age gap was historically accurate. On screen, however, the optics were very different. Melissa Gilbert was only 15 years old when she filmed Sweet 16, the episode where Laura finally captures Almanzo's heart. Butler, meanwhile, was 23. At the time, producers defended the storyline as faithful to the historical record, but the 8-year difference between the actors added an undeniable layer of discomfort. Melissa Gilbert herself later spoke about how awkward and vulnerable she felt filming romantic scenes opposite an adult man. While viewers in the late 1970s largely accepted the relationship as innocent and romantic, today such casting choices would almost certainly trigger widespread backlash, given current awareness about power dynamics and the responsibility of protecting underage actors on set. And Laura's storyline wasn't the only instance of questionable romantic plotting involving minors. Allison's character, Nellie Oleson, was just 13 years old when she appeared in the Season 2 episode Here Come the Brides. In the story, Nellie entertains romantic interest from an older teen boy, a plotline that, at the time, may have been brushed off as lighthearted or even humorous. Yet by contemporary standards, the idea of pairing a 13-year-old character with an older suitor on a family show feels deeply inappropriate. Allison herself has often spoken candidly about the strange dynamics she experienced as a young actress. Beyond matters of romance and sexuality, Little House also courted controversy when it turned to issues of race. In Season 3's Wisdom of Solomon, the show tackled themes of racism and slavery through the story of a young black boy named Solomon who asks to be adopted by the Ingalls family because he believes a white family will offer him a better life. The episode was lauded by some viewers for daring to address racial inequality on a popular family show, especially at a time when many series avoided such discussions altogether. Yet others criticized it for oversimplifying the harsh realities of racism and for framing the issue primarily through the perspective of white saviorism. While Landon's intention may have been to spark empathy and deliver a moral lesson about equality, in execution, the episode reflected the limitations of its time, along with a sentimental resolution that glossed over deeper systemic issues. Taken together, these controversial storylines pretty much show the complicated legacy of Little House on the Prairie. On the one hand, the show was undeniably bold in its willingness to step outside the expected boundaries of family television. It brought conversations about intimate assault, teenage pregnancy, racism, and social judgment into living rooms across America. For many viewers, this was their first exposure to such difficult topics, and the show's handling of them, even if flawed, was seen as courageous. On the other hand, the series often stumbled when judged by modern standards, either by placing young actors in questionable situations or by approaching serious issues with a lens that now feels outdated. So, how did the public feel about it all? The ups, the downs, and eventually the end. Public reaction and legacy. Well, in the beginning, they loved it. When Little House on the Prairie first aired, it was sold as wholesome family television, a safe, moral alternative in an era when much of network TV was moving toward grittier realism. Parents trusted it, children absorbed it, and critics at first dismissed it as sentimental escapism. Yet, as the series unfolded, something unusual happened. The show not only maintained its reputation for heartwarming, homespun values, but also became a lightning rod for more serious conversations. At the time, fan reception was overwhelmingly loyal. Families tuned in week after week, and the series consistently ranked among the top 20 programs in the Nielsen ratings during its early years. Viewers wrote letters praising the way the show combined moral lessons with adventure, often thanking Landon for giving them something they could watch together across generations. Syndication only deepened its cultural footprint, introducing the Ingalls family to audiences who hadn't been alive during its first run. But critics were more divided. Some praised the series for its ambition to tell more complex stories than its saccharine reputation suggested. Episodes like The Wisdom of Solomon, which centered on race relations in 19th century America, or the harrowing Sylvia storyline about sexual assault, proved that Little House was willing to test the limits of family programming. Others, however, argued that the show's blend of sentimentality and tragedy often tipped into melodrama, with Landon accused of manipulating viewers' emotions through swelling music and tear-jerking performances. To some critics, it was the very definition of cornball TV. As years passed, however, the conversation began to shift. Melissa Gilbert, in her memoir, wrote candidly about how deeply the show impacted her own childhood, but also how it forced her into emotionally demanding performances far beyond her years. She recalled crying so much on set that producers jokingly called her one-take Gilbert because of her ability to weep on command. To Gilbert, Little House wasn't just a nostalgic relic. It was a crucible of real, often difficult emotions wrapped inside a family-friendly package. That authenticity, she later reflected, is one reason the show has endured. Because even when it tackled unsettling themes, it did so with sincerity rather than cynicism. In recent decades, as television has grown bolder in depicting trauma, identity, and social inequality, Little House has been re-examined through a different lens. Scholars and critics alike now point out that the show was, in its own way, ahead of its time. While some of its portrayals now feel dated, the very fact that it attempted to address race, disability, addiction, poverty, and gender roles within the frame of a 1970s family drama has earned it respect. In fact, many modern audiences are surprised at how often Little House strayed into morally complicated or tragic territory, something obscured by its wholesome reputation. This re-evaluation became particularly pointed when discussions of rebooting the franchise surfaced in the 2010s and again in the 2020s. Some cast members bristled at the idea of a modernized version that might lean into what detractors called woke storytelling. Allison, for example, noted that the original series had already tackled weighty subjects long before television executives were comfortable with such material. To her and others, there was nothing soft about Little House on the Prairie. It had already broken ground in a quiet but lasting way. Do you feel the same way? Tell us in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Please leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you're notified whenever we upload a new video.